Hi guys, welcome back to our virtual AP Environmental Science classroom. It's great to virtually see you today. I'm Ms. Fassler coming to you from Marshfield High School in Marshfield, Wisconsin. We're going to start our warm up by taking a look at the pesticide experimental design question that you worked at for homework. Let's begin by reviewing the prompt that you started with here with the background information. The active ingredients in many pesticides are chemicals that kill organisms such as insects, molds, and weeds. Proponents, people that are pro the use of that insecticide, claim that pesticides improve crop yield and thus protect land and soil by reducing the conversion of forests and wetlands to croplands. Opponents of pesticide use claim that pesticides degrade water and soil quality and that other modern agriculture techniques and practices are responsible for increased or improved crop yields in recent years. Before we look at the questions, just remember a great strategy that you want to use on the national exam is just take a minute and read that entire prompt before you jump in and start answering the first question. You really want to know where that question, how that question is progressing from one topic to another and how all of that is going to integrate. And trust Dr. Sowell and I when we say that if you take that few minutes and really process and think about the question, take some notes as you're reading it, the writing of it itself, your final answer is really going to come together quite easily. So we start off with letter A with our experimental design part of the question. Design a laboratory experiment to determine whether or not a new pesticide, product X, is toxic to minnows, a small fish. For the experiment you designed, be sure to include all of the following. For 1 point, you needed to state a hypothesis, and there's 2 criteria you need to earn that 1 point. First of all, the hypothesis has to predict the relationship between product X and minnow health. And the prediction needs to state which direction or that impact is going to be. For example, I could say that an increase in the concentration of product X will increase minnow mortality, or I could say, does decreasing exposure result in increased survivorship of the minnows? It's kind of saying the same thing a different way. You could also have stated it as a null hypothesis. Concentration will have no effect. If you've not used a null hypothesis in your classroom, don't worry about it. You would never be required to state a null hypothesis. Next, we're going to, for 1 point, describe the method that you would use to test your hypothesis. And in order to get this point, notice that you need 3 experimental groups, or at least 3 different treatments. I'm guessing I always kind of prompt my students to use even more than that to be on the safe side. And at least one of those is a group that's not been exposed to product X. So what we mean by that is I need to have a group that got no exposure to product X. And then in this rubric, I needed at least 2 other concentrations so that I don't just have no product X and a lot of product X. I'd like to hone in a little bit more on what concentration was harmful. If you go back and watch the earlier video on toxicity, we go through a lot of review of this as well. For the next point, you had to identify the control. Remember, the control in your experiment does not get any exposure to whatever that independent variable is. So my exposure in raising the minnows might have simply been the normal pond water that those minnows lived in with no product X at all. And finally, identifying the dependent variable. If I change or control the concentration, what will change as a result of that? And you probably said something about minnow health. You may have said how many minnows die, or some way to assess the health of the minnow. Letter B, describe the experimental result that would lead you to reject your hypothesis. In other words, if something happened where there was no relationship between chemical X and minnow mortality, I would therefore reject my hypothesis. Letter C, one strategy for dealing with agricultural pests is integrated pest management, or IPM. For 3 points, you had to describe IPM, and as part of that description, give 2 specific pest approaches that are part of that integrated strategy. So for the first point, it was sort of a definition of a characteristic of IPM. I'm guessing a lot of you said something about a combination of either physical, chemical, or biological. Notice you needed at least 2 of those strategies. You could also have talked about IPM being used to reduce or eliminate the use of pesticides, or to reduce pest populations to an acceptable level. Remember that I want to not kill every pest, but kill enough of them that I still have a yield that I can harvest from my crop. The other 2 points then are for giving a specific approach. And so you could have gone with some type of physical barrier. You could have gone with some type of chemical approach other than the pesticide itself, like spraying a pheromone, those chemicals that the insect naturally releases to attract predators. If I spray that pheromone, all the insects are attracted to that, and then I can trap them or catch them in some way. So there's a lot of different statements that you could have made about specific strategies. Next, for 1 point, an environmental benefit of IPM. It could reduce the amount of pesticides that I use. It could reduce the amount of runoff from those pesticides. It could reduce the erosion. It could prevent the killing of non-target insects like honeybees. And finally, describe 2 agriculture practices other than those involving pest control that increase crop yield. And one of the things we're really going to focus on today is that task verb describe. We're going to dig into that really deeply. And I want you to focus on the part of the rubric here that says what you needed to do to get that point. There's a difference, remember, between identifying an agricultural practice and describing an agriculture practice. And I know that a lot of my students, when they read this, they think they just have to describe what contour plowing is. But what you need to do is describe how that practice would increase crop yield. And when you look at the rubric, it appears as if it's almost just an identify point. A lot of the description of how that practice would increase crop yield isn't necessarily spelled out. The rubric is just this bulleted list of possible responses. It's not the entire 10-page essay of all those descriptions. So for example, I could say that applying fertilizer is a way to increase crop yield, but I wouldn't get the point until I said adding fertilizers, which improves the nutrient content of the soil, will increase crop yield. So we're really going to focus on that describe term today. So let's take a quick look at where we're going. Just remember that your exam is open notebook on May 18th, and you want to check out that website that the College Board has provided really great tips to prompt you how to get organized for this. In addition to what Dr. Sowell and I are sharing with you, I just pulled out 2 of those little tips to focus on today. Your class notes are better than internet searches. Dr. Sowell and I are making sure we're providing the information for the review for you, that you don't have to go out and look for it in any other source, that you're not really sure if that's good information or not. And this is very important. Collaborating with others is not considered acceptable open notes. And you really want to read about the criteria associated with exam security and the consequences for violating that. So where we're going today, I misspoke the other day. I said we were going to get through Unit 5 in 3 lessons. It's actually 4. So this is our third of 4 lessons on Unit 5. And what we're really looking at today is kind of a problem solution. What are the problems associated with the way we harvest trees, and some viable strategies to mitigate that? What are some problems associated with how we harvest fish, and some solutions or strategies for that? Really focusing in on these 2 big ideas. How does our use of natural resources impact the world, and why it's often so difficult to achieve sustainable resource use? I really want to focus on, as well as describing like we just did with that IPM question. Notice our skill number 7 here is all about solutions. And the letters sort of scaffold at what level I need to be able to demonstrate that skill. Everything from just describing a potential solution to describing the advantages or disadvantages or unintended consequences, and then going even a little bit further to justifying why my proposed solution is the best solution. And maybe it might be picking one solution. Are you going to go with IPM or a different strategy? So let's dig in, and remember that we're really focusing on that describing and justifying solutions. That's going to be our main focus today. Before we get into clear cutting and some of those practices, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about why we cut down trees to begin with. And that looks a little bit different in the developed world, like in the United States and Germany, where that has a lot of logging. For the most part, our logging practices are pretty sustainable. We've been doing this a while. We typically value good research in how our forests are managed and apply those best practices. That's very different in the developing world, where they will clear large tracts of forested land for agricultural land or pasture land. And another big reason for that is for charcoal production. This is a picture that I took. It's kind of almost downtown Nairobi in Kenya, in East Africa. And they don't have an energy infrastructure. And we're going to go into energy next week, but they don't have a line that delivers natural gas to them, or they don't plug a stove in for electricity. Often what they do is they just walk down to this little kiosk down the street here and purchase a bucket of charcoal. And that came from cutting down trees. So if you have a campfire and the next morning you go out and there's some little hunks of charred wood left, and you could probably spark that and get that to burn again. That's pretty much what this charcoal is. It's a very unsustainable and really inefficient source of fuel. So in the developed world, we practice, like I said, for the most part, pretty sustainable forest management. The main reasons we would cut down trees would be for wood products, everything from construction material to paper products that we make, and as a management technique for maintaining a healthy forest ecosystem. So let's just do the quick review. What is a clear cut? It's the removal of all the trees from a tract of forested land in one area. It leaves a big opening, very obvious. It's a pretty broad term that can really be used to describe a lot of different kinds of clear cuts. There's a really big difference between a small clear cut that I might make, even though it classifies as removing all the trees from a forested tract of land. If it's a 20 hectare or a 50-acre clear cut, that's not going to have near the environmental impacts as a very large clear cut like this one is going to have. And we're really going to focus on these really negative impacts of these very large clear cuts. This is not a logging operation where somebody is manually going in with a chainsaw and cutting down individual trees. And that might happen in a small clear cut. This is where very large logging equipment is going through and at a very large scale, removing all those trees very quickly. So that's the reason that we clear cut. It's quick, it's easy, and it's certainly the most cost-effective way of removing trees. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at some of these other advantages and disadvantages of the way that we remove trees. So some of the impacts of clear cutting, if we want to know what the impacts of taking all these large trees from a big tract of land is, we probably better start with just a real quick review of the ecosystem services of forests, because that's where I'm going to get that describe point, is really showing that I understand the actual impact in a lot of detail. So we have these provisioning and regulating and supporting and cultural ecosystem services. And it's very obvious when I look at this image of this big clear cut and I look at the ecosystem services, there's no longer that vegetation there anchoring the soil. So I get a large amount of erosion. I remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I'm no longer removing that carbon dioxide, so I'm no longer sequestering carbon or moderating climate. Trees produce oxygen, which everybody needs for survival, and they provide habitat for wildlife. So those wildlife can rear their young and have nesting sites or denning sites and hide from predators. Now we're really going to dig into that describe aspect then. I want to look at, keeping in mind those ecosystem services, some of the impacts of clear cutting. And a couple of those really integrate the idea of how forests and the water cycle connect together. So if I increase soil erosion, I could have an increase in stream temperature because those soil particles trap heat. When the sun shines on that stream, after that water is run downhill from that area I clear cut, if there's a lot of solid particulate soil in there, when sun strikes that surface of that water, instead of being able to penetrate, it's caught by those solid particles and really heats that surface water. It could increase flooding in the watershed because I no longer have that infiltration, or like I'm seeing in the diagram here, I'm no longer allowing that water to seep in and recharge groundwater. I could have a loss of biodiversity because of a loss of habitat, and I could accelerate climate change because of the loss of carbon sink, or the fact, remember in slash and burn agriculture, they burn the remains of that wood to put the nutrient ash on the soil. But the minute I burn that wood, that carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere. Even if I cut those trees down and leave all of that slash and the small limbs and everything on the ground, then they're going to decompose, and that carbon is going to be put back into the atmosphere as either carbon dioxide or methane. So if we want to manage our forests sustainably, we want to look at other techniques besides clear cutting. So the idea of sustainable yield just ties in perfectly. What we're going to do is look at ways that we can log, because we need the resources. We have to find a way to get them in a sustainable way. And then we'll move into some other strategies to mitigate once I've actually cut down the forest. So just remember that idea of sustainable yield really is going to apply when we review that idea of selective cutting. Practice of selecting certain trees within my stand. In clear cutting, that big piece of equipment comes through and plows out all of those trees. But in selective cutting, I'm saying, okay, here's how many trees I can take, but still leave a viable stand of trees. And I'm going to want to make sure I have an uneven age stand or a multi-age class stand left. In our simple diagram here, there might be different trees of different ages and sizes or different species, so that I am still fulfilling all the ecosystem services of that forest. Sustainable yield. I can harvest some trees, I can get economic profit and fulfill my need for the wood products, but I still have an intact forest ecosystem. And one of the ecosystem services that we tend to forget is that cultural ecosystem service, that value that I get from having wild places. In this area that's been selectively cut, there's a couple tree stumps here and there, and a logger's going to go through and mark which trees they're going to take. It's a very prescriptive process to know how many board feet of lumber I need to get out of there, what it's going to cost me, so I can still make a profit, but still leave an intact ecosystem. And I would still go hiking or cross-country skiing or set up my tent and camp. I could still hike, or I could still hunt, and really provide all the services that that forest did before I cut it. And there's plenty of trees left of different ages to regenerate. Another really good sustainable forestry technique to reduce the amount of trees that we cut is to find alternatives for those wood or paper products that we need. And one of the best ways that we can find alternatives is for what we call pulpwood products that we purchase. We all know that paper comes from trees. Toilet paper comes from trees. There's a lot of cutting trees down to make a lot of toilet paper these days. So what they do is they take wood and they kind of cook it down and they add some chemicals, and they just really focus on the strong cellulosic material, the fibrous material of that wood, and ultimately turn it into paper. So I could find alternatives. I could use a composite wood. Here's an example of decking made. There might be some wood fiber in there, but it's integrated in with even perhaps recycled plastic for that composite wood that's got a number of different kinds of particles mixed together. I don't know if you know what particle board is. You do, but you may not know that you know it. I take like little wood chips and products and press them all together, low quality leftover kind of wood scrap, and press it together to make boards of lumber, if you will. Well, I don't really have to take trees that maybe took 40 years to grow, and I cut those down, and a lot of the impacts of that, I can grow straw annually, really easy to harvest, and I have the same fibrous material from that. Bamboo, a lot of you may be aware that bamboo is a very rapidly growing plant, so I can harvest it each year and it really quickly rejuvenates. So we could buy toilet paper made from bamboo rather than trees that took 40 years to grow. Hemp is another fibrous material. We think of hemp as rope. During World War II, there was a big push to get farmers to start producing hemp for the war effort, because again, what I'm looking for is a cellulosic fibrous material that I can capitalize on that rapidly growing fibrous plant that instead of trees that take a long time to grow and harvest. Palm leaves are being used for disposable paper plates, but again, instead of a tree, I'm using a rapidly growing plant. Please remember that when you have to provide solutions, I can never provide a solution that just simply says, well, don't cut down any trees or ban a practice. What is appropriate is replacing part of that practice with something that's more sustainable, an alternative. The other really good solution that we want to talk about is making smart, educated consumer choices. So if I'm going to buy wood products, if I'm going to build a house or buy lumber for a project for my home, I can look for wood products that have the Forest Stewardship Council logo. So if I am running a timber stand and selling wood products, I may work with this organization and they're going to come out and inspect and make sure I'm using best practices for sustainable management. And they're going to say, you're a good company. We're going to certify you so that as a consumer, I know that I'm supporting a sustainable practice. And we always can reduce and reuse and recycle our wood products. I can recycle reclaimed wood. I can go to a secondhand store to buy a piece of furniture rather than buying a new piece of furniture. I could refinish an old piece of furniture rather than replacing it with a new one. So let's now move into sort of the next phase of sustainable forestry. We've just talked about all the things that could reduce the amount of trees that we have to cut through selective cutting and using less and making best choices through substitution. Well, now what happens, we would have an area that has been pretty damaged by deforestation and we want to reforest it. And I'm going to show you three kind of broad techniques that you could use as solutions. One would be nonprofit organizations like the Nature Conservancy. They certainly do work globally, but in the United States, their reforestation project is Plant a Billion Trees. And they have a number of projects scattered throughout the country where they have found areas that have suffered from significant deforestation, areas that may have lost 90% of their native timber stands. Maybe it's an area that has some endangered species that really needs to have that habitat reforested so that the species can rebound. The next method for reforestation could be a private landowner. Working with the American Tree Farm Association as a private landowner, I might still need to harvest some timber from my land so that I can make a profit and pay my taxes. But the Tree Farm Association is going to help me manage that. They're going to help me go in and say, well, here's about how many trees you could take. Here's what age we suggest. So that's a really good option. Or this really interesting concept called debt for nature. It works in the United States with a landowner that might have forested land, maybe wetland, maybe it's a farmer that has part of their land that they own in forested land surrounding their fields. And in the Debt for Nature program, that landowner enters into a conservation contract and they say, I agree for whatever period of time that I am not going to develop this land. I'm going to keep it as a forested, intact ecosystem. And in exchange for that, I get a reduction of some of the debt that I might owe on my land. It's a really good way to keep land for struggling landowners in their family, and reduce the debt load that they have. This actually was applied on an international level in 2010 with the United States and Brazilian governments. They owed us some money that we had borrowed them, and we forgave some of that debt in the agreement that they put some of that land in conservation, or agreed not to cut certain areas of land. It's a solution or strategy that I think a lot of times gets a little bit underlooked or underutilized, if you will. So we understand that tropical rainforests are a global resource. We all need and benefit from the maintenance of forested land in the Amazon forests of Brazil. So it is of value for other developed countries to try to assist these developing countries that really just need economic growth, and they have a resource that they can harvest. We should just pay them to say, don't cut your trees, to value that global resource. And then we have grassroots efforts like the efforts of Wangari Maathai. You may have heard of her. She was a Kenyan woman who actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work with the Greenbelt movement in Africa. And aside from just planting ultimately over 50 million trees, she got individual women to take little tree seedlings and go out and plant them. And a more long-lasting legacy, I believe, is that she really got these women, a new generation of women in Africa, to embrace the rich resources that they have and preserve them for their future, for their children's generations. Certainly, we see evidence of this all the time. And one of my favorite quotes of all times, from Margaret Mead: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And that's how we as APES teachers are inspired sometimes to keep going, because we know that you guys embrace that as students, embrace that idea as well. So before we go on to do a quick check, I want to share with you a very positive story. Remember, parts of Unit 5 here can get a little bit overwhelming with some of the unsustainable practices that we talk about. So I'm going to share just a couple of minutes of a really exciting, positive story that's happening at the grassroots level in the Darien Gap. So we're going to go to Panama for a couple of minutes.
Among endangered tropical forests, this one is unique. This forest sits in the middle of the longest road on Earth, the Pan American Highway, which runs from the tip of Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, Chile. The forest is called the Darien Gap because it is the only interruption in the highway. Within this region lies Darien National Park. Throughout history, Darien's rough terrain has shielded it from the outside world. But today, as tendrils of development spread from the road, pressures mount, from illegal loggers to migrant ranchers that are pushing deeper into the gap, slashing and burning to create pasture land. This threatened forest is home to wildlife and indigenous people who have lived here for thousands of years.
Soy Carlos Obiaza, soy enverada del área de la región del Darién. Actualmente formo parte de lo que es el Sistema de Información Geográfico Indígena, lo que es el mapeo con drones.
The maps being produced with support of scientists of the Rainforest Foundation are powerful tools for indigenous communities. They use them to get legal titles for their land, to create sustainable land use plans and to monitor their forests as outside pressures close in on the gap.
Cuando veo estos tipos de amenazas para nuestros pueblos, para nuestros territorios, no tener un título colectivo nos hace impotente a cualquier situación que nosotros queramos hacer. No hay apoyo de...
If you want to watch the rest of it, it really is a great story and very inspiring. Now, they work with the International Rainforest Foundation, but they involve the entire community, young people, women. They understand the value of maintaining forested land for clean water. They work with the Rainforest Foundation to say, can I clear, they still need to grow food. Can I clear small tracts of land, but do it in a sustainable way? And really in the bigger scheme of things, giving them the power to take control of their lands and keep those invading forces off. So really some great cool things happening in the Darien Gap. So let's do a quick check for understanding of the forestry concepts that we talked about. After intensive logging, most of the trees along a stream have been removed. Which of the following water quality changes would most likely occur downstream from logging? You may not have known this. That's why I really wanted to focus on that increase in temperature. It's sort of there's a sort of a one more leap before I get to that increased temperature. So cut down the trees, sediment erodes, that sediment traps additional heat. Which of the following environmental effects would most likely result from the clear cutting of boreal forests by industrial logging operations? And obviously that would be letter A. I think they kind of specified boreal forest, and I'm probably not clearing land in the boreal forest. It's just not a climate capable of producing a lot of food. I think we have one more here. Sustainable use of forest in the United States would likely be encouraged by. And again, that's a pretty easy one as well. Look at the verbiage there. That's one of the reasons I wanted to put this question in. If I have to describe the difference between clear cutting and selective cutting, or justify why one of those is a better practice than the other, this idea of an uneven age stand, that I'm cutting trees of various sizes and ages. I want to go through just a little bit of a guided practice because, gosh, we haven't even looked at a data table or a graph yet today. So here is an image that shows me changes in forest cover. So let's use our I-squared technique, identify, interpret, and then we'll answer a couple questions. My x-axis is years. From like 2000 to 2001. My y-axis is annual forest loss in kilometers squared. So that's an area value, the area of loss of forested land annually. So in 2000 to 2001, that's an annual cycle, I lost about 7,500 square kilometers of forested land. In Indonesia, this is Brazil. And there's some statistical values represented here that represent that trend line. I want to really focus in on this value. This is the forest loss annual increment. So my x-axis is time, my y-axis, annual forest loss in kilometers squared. Now let's do an interpretation. What does this mean to have an increasing or a decreasing trend in forest loss? Is forest loss occurring faster or slower as time goes on in each of these scenarios? So in Indonesia, my forest loss annually, every year, I'm losing 1,021 square kilometers of forest land. In Brazil, that's a negative, well, it's a negative slope to my line. I can see it's downward trending. In Brazil, my annual forest loss is negative 1,318 kilometers squared. So let's see if we can make a statement then that answers this. Increasing forest loss is a positive slope. It means there's a faster rate of forest loss. Whereas the decreasing forest loss, that negative slope, says that each year there is a decrease in the area of forest loss. If I just like really quickly glanced at these graphs, I might say, oh, Indonesia is seeing an increase in forest land and Brazil is seeing a decrease, but it's looking at forest loss. So the question I might be asked about this is, using these figures, make a claim about which country is at the greatest risk for forest loss in 2013. And that would obviously be Indonesia. We would predict that in 2013, they would have lost another 1,020 kilometers squared. Now, I can't say that Brazil is gaining forested land. I don't know what they're doing from this graph in terms of reforestation, but during, and I'll qualify that because it's not quite the same now, during this period of time, Brazil was seeing 1,318 kilometers squared less land cut every year. They were decreasing the amount of deforestation. All right, now let's go on to the second half of our lesson. Oh, wait a minute, we have just a little bit more on forestry. Not too much to say. In terms of pest control, all that you learned about IPM with Dr. Sowell and integrated pest management for agriculture, all that same biological, physical, chemical, same things apply in forest management. Another thing I can do for pest control is removal of trees. This is an example where a small clear cut in an area of pine trees that have been infested with the mountain pine beetle. We talked about that in the invasive species lecture. This might be a time where that is justified because the drawbacks associated with that clear cut are outweighed by the fact that I don't want that beetle to spread to other trees. So I could take out individual infected trees, or I may have a small clear cut. We also have to talk a little bit about the role of fire in managing forest ecosystems. Remember that a periodic fire can be beneficial. And this is where, again, I'm really going to focus on that describe term. A periodic fire can be beneficial because it reduces fuel load. That's an identify point. I have to make sure I spiral all the way around and say, why does reducing fuel load provide for a healthy forest ecosystem? Well, it prevents a more destructive fire that might take out more species. Periodic fire can be beneficial because it kills trees infected with pathogens. But I've got to make sure that I describe why killing trees is beneficial. Well, I can prevent it to spreading to other trees. Recycles nutrients back in the soil, which improves soil fertility. Opens the forest canopy, which stimulates the growth of new species that like sun. Protects communities from extreme fire and reduces the economic impact of those disasters. Improves habitat and stimulates new growth, which provides habitat for a diverse number of species and provides conditions necessary for certain species of trees or wildflowers because they need heat to release their seed and promote their growth. I'll just mention a little bit about prescribed burns, both in a forestry setting. The state of California has embraced prescribed burning because they had a lot of fire suppression and built up a lot of that fuel load. And so that their problems are being exacerbated by climate change, which is causing death of more trees, which means there's more dry wood and more fuel for a severe fire. So in order to prevent a more severe fire, I can go in periodically and start a fire on a small controlled scale to burn up some of that fuel load that's laying on the forest floor, all that dead wood, so that if a fire accidentally starts, it's not going to have as much fuel and I can contain it a lot more easily. And the positive note here, the forester is monitoring the new growth of trees after that prescribed burn. We also remember that point about how some species need fire in order to release their seeds. Well, that's a natural part of prairie management where fires are set on on a rotating few-year cycle basis. It's really what created grasslands to begin with. Remember, these are some of the most fertile ecosystems in the world, temperate grasslands. And the reason is because fire would normally start either by lightning or Native Americans. We now know that in order to maintain or restore a prairie, we need to integrate that as it's an essential part of the management tool of that prairie. And that's how we end up with all of the beautiful blue stem grasses and purple cone flowers and all the beautiful prairie flowers that need that heat to release their seeds often. So let's do another quick check for understanding on that by looking at a logging question. State is considering opening an area of old growth forest on state land to logging. Officials debate the best way to log the forest. One official advocates for clear cutting 1 hectare, that's a small plot, in the middle of every 20 hectares of an intact old growth forest. The official says this pattern will maximize biodiversity while still allowing the harvesting of timber. Explain how the pattern of biodiversity, explain how the pattern could produce more biodiversity than the old growth forest alone. Well, I could say things again that there are some species that like sunlight, not all species like that old growth forest habitat. So I provide new species with new niches, some of those early succession communities. And another official wants to harvest timber in a more sustainable way. The official wants to assess individual trees and remove only the most economically valuable trees that would help maintain the forest ecosystem. Propose a logging technique that would best meet these 2 goals. Survey says selective cutting. So we still are harvesting, I'm still meeting my economic needs, but I'm leaving an intact stand of trees. Now we're going to shift gears and go to harvesting fish. So some of the causes of overfishing, they're really pretty simple. We just are not fishing at a sustainable yield, right? We're taking more fish than and not leaving enough fish stock population to repopulate that. Our large scale fishing techniques can seek out every fish in an area that we're fishing and leave nothing for repopulating that. The reasons for that, unfortunately, are pretty straightforward. It seems like there's just a lack of global willpower, a lack of global legislation and enforcement of that legislation. And as a result of that, the #1 cause of overfishing is illegal fishing. It's estimated that illegal, unreported or unregulated fishing, and unreported is important because if a country says, oh, we're only harvesting this much, it may look like they're harvesting at a sustainable rate, but they're kind of lying about their catch. Altogether, that's over $36 billion a year. So let's dig into this a little bit more deeply. Certainly one of the impacts of overfishing is loss of biodiversity, because got to make sure I say why overfishing causes a loss of biodiversity. I'm removing a species that might disrupt an entire food chain. I may have a trophic cascade based on the species of fish I remove, and a large number of my fish are often caught by, I catch non-target species through gill nets or drift nets or other fishing techniques that I use. Another impact of overfishing is loss of food security for people that are fishing on a more sustainable or subsistence level, where they're catching enough fish through small scale fishing techniques to feed their family and maybe sell a little bit. And the destruction of ecosystems caused by these many different fishing techniques, but trawling, I think, is an easy one for kids to remember, where I drag that heavy weighted net along an ocean floor. I can destroy an entire coral reef. So not only am I netting fish, there's a lot of bycatch, that unintended species, and I am potentially destroying the habitat that's going to further prevent those populations from rebounding. Some of the solutions, again, they sound kind of easy. We need international legislation and international enforcement and accountability. But here's, just like with forest products, I can make really smart choices as a consumer. And I like this because this is something that you can do directly or even try to influence your parents to make some sustainable choices. And just like we had that label for sustainably produced wood, there are labels that I can have for sustainably caught fish as well, and different species that are the best fish because their populations are strong and those ocean fisheries are appropriately managed, to fish that I really should avoid and try not to eat at any cost because of the current state of that fish supply. One solution to large-scale loss of ocean fisheries is aquaculture. And in its simplest form, aquaculture is simply rearing animals in an enclosed area rather than catching them in the wild. I have this I have a fish farm that I create where I'm raising fish. And as you can see from the graph, fish farming has really taken off. When I look at this graph, I can see that my wild capture really is kind of flatlined for decades. The amount of fish that we're capturing from the wild really hasn't increased. And as a scientist, one question we might have is, well, is that simply because aquaculture has taken off and I don't need to fish as much in the oceans, or there just isn't as many fish left? This also should raise a question for us about, okay, it looks like we've really quadrupled the amount of aquaculture production. This is tons of fish harvested. Are there any impacts associated with that we should be aware of? So here are essential knowledge statements that we'll take a look at in terms of aquaculture. This is, if you remember when you studied this in your class, we really can describe these large aquaculture operations as CAFOs on the water. You talked about CAFOs with Dr. Sowell, that concentrated animal feeding operation. All of the problems associated with the CAFO on land correlate to problems associated with large scale industrial aquaculture as well. So those problems, first of all, as we could tell from that previous graph, the industry has grown and it isn't very regulated. It has grown so fast that the ability to sort of monitor what's happening and where those fish farms are springing up is very challenging. There's a very high density of fish in a very small area, just like the CAFO, that leads to disease transmission and often the use of antibiotics. It leads to a fish poop, and they're all fishing and pooping where all those fish are in that concentrated area, and that accumulates waste and dead zones in that area. Those wild fish are often genetically modified or bred to grow really, really fast, really, really quickly and get to market. So if those wild fish escape, they're often very aggressive breeders, can breed with native fish and reduce the biodiversity in my native fish stocks. And if we look at where these fish are being raised, where most of the really skyrocketing growth of aquaculture is happening, it's happening in countries that may not have environmental regulation or regulation that adequately monitors their food supply. So if I don't have any water pollution control laws, I could have raw sewage running off and entering the area where my aquaculture, where my fish farm is. I could have heavy metal contamination. All kinds of different toxins could be present in the environment in which that fish is being raised. And I, as a consumer, may not know that. I want to seek out the origin of where that fish is sourced from and make some smart consumer choices about aquaculture versus wild caught fish. I don't want to give you the impression that all aquaculture is bad. We as consumers need to make an informed decision about where that farm raised fish is coming from and the conditions in which it was raised. And that's why we have that certification. To alleviate some of those problems, we do have sustainable aquaculture. This is this land-based fish farming where fish are raised in these tanks. That water is constantly being recirculated, cleaned, and put back in. So it's a sustainable use of water. It's growing fish in an environment in which I can control the quality of the water and the waste, and doesn't have the impact on coastal ecosystems that some aquaculture does. So we've covered quite a bit for today. Let's take a quick look and do a couple questions on aquaculture. Have to have another graph. This graph shows worldwide catch of orange roughy, a type of wild fish caught, a type of wild fish. And this represents the amount of fish caught in tons from 1977 to 2011. And this is giving me my quantity of fish. It's a pretty easy graph to interpret. Based on the data, which of the following fish practice solutions would best promote sustainability of the population? And again, establishing quotas for the number of orange roughy that are caught. You want to have that term sustainable yield in your notes, because if I simply said I could fish orange roughy at a sustainable yield and only take enough that I leave enough breeding stock to repopulate, easy point. Which of the following is true of farm-raised salmon? This is kind of specific. They are often infected with parasites and sea lice. It's a pretty interesting story about fish farming in British Columbia, up in the Pacific Northwest, where these huge fish farms have emerged. And kind of long story short, this parasite, this sea lice, always has infected salmon to a small degree, but their life cycles are such that when the fish is in the open water and it could be infected with lice, the lice just aren't that, there's not many there. It doesn't jive with their life cycle. And remember, fish migrate, swim back upstream to their original area to spawn and mate. So what happens is that in order to get back to their original spot where they're going to spawn and mate, they have to swim through the area where these fish CAFOs are, and all the lice have accumulated in that area. I think we have one more question here. The farming of fish such as salmon at aquaculture facilities poses a threat to marine ecosystems because. And that's something that we just talked about as well. So just a quick debrief here. Remember, we wanted to really focus on describing. We looked at problems with harvesting trees, solutions, problems with harvesting fish, solutions, but we really focused in on how I accurately and sufficiently do that describing to make sure I actually don't state just here's the impact, but how does that impact do what it does, and justifying, presenting solutions, listing advantages and disadvantages, and justifying those solutions. Hope you guys are hanging in there. We're kind of getting close to the end. We're going to have lots of time to review before that May 18th date. Here's your homework for tonight. It's about the island of Hispaniola, that is both the countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and some issues that they're dealing with deforestation, and then just a little link into human population to keep you going on that. So hope you guys are hanging in there. Just remember to look at that sheet, the sheet about best tips and practices for online exam taking. Start getting your notes organized, focus in on those skills, and I will see you next time. Enjoy your wrap up with Unit 5 with Dr. Sowell tomorrow. Take care, guys.